Western societies, particularly those in North America such as Canada and the United States, face unprecedented challenges from unrestricted immigration policies that facilitate the influx of foreign populations. These policies have resulted in demographic shifts where newcomers from regions like South Asia, including India and Pakistan, secure employment and welfare benefits, often at the expense of established communities of European descent. The openness traditionally associated with these nations, characterized by friendliness and inclusivity, has been exploited, leading to economic undercutting, housing competition, and cultural erosion. This situation demands a re-evaluation of societal norms to prioritize self-determination and resource protection for indigenous Western populations. By reframing certain conceptual tools historically deemed negative, individuals and groups can assert boundaries without resorting to unlawful means, thereby countering the invasion through strategic selectivity. The core concepts under consideration, racism, discrimination, and prejudice, serve as mechanisms for this reclamation. Racism entails the prioritization of one's racial or ethnic group. Discrimination involves selective treatment based on characteristics like national origin, and prejudice represents preconceived attitudes favoring cultural homogeneity. These terms, embedded in legal frameworks promoting equality, exhibit inherent ambiguity, allowing for interpretive application in various directions. Laws such as Canada's Human Rights Act and the United States Civil Rights Act, while intended to foster integration, create a duality where enforcement can benefit any group asserting disadvantage. This flexibility enables Western populations to utilize these concepts defensively, transforming them from barriers to openness into instruments for closure and preservation. In this context, the process begins at the individual level, escalating to collective and institutional scales. Personal empowerment arises from acknowledging these tools as neutral and applicable for self-advancement, countering opposing forces that impose their own biases. Through a spectrum of behaviors, from passive avoidance to assertive expressions, individuals can cultivate comfort and functionality, inspiring broader societal shifts. This approach addresses the concurrent global forces that have synchronized immigration policies across Western nations, undermining self-sufficiency. By harnessing emotional, verbal, and physical resources lawfully, the framework establishes precedents for escalation, ultimately aiming for the removal of foreign elements through non-judicial means. Conceptual definitions and oppositional frameworks. Racism embodies the conviction that one's racial heritage holds intrinsic superiority or greater value, translating into behaviors that actively uphold cultural and societal dominance for that group. This manifests through deliberate actions designed to preserve ethnic integrity and prevent external dilutions or dilutions from incompatible elements. Discrimination, as an extension, operationalizes this conviction by imposing differential treatment rooted in ethnic, national, or origin-based distinctions, ensuring that resources, opportunities, and access systematically favor the in-group while restricting outsiders. Prejudice serves as the foundational mindset, consisting of ingrained attitudes that instinctively safeguard group interests by viewing foreign or invading populations with inherent caution, suspicion, or outright disfavor. These concepts have been legislated and institutionalized in Western societies primarily to enforce multiculturalism and openness, embedding them in statutes that dismantle traditional barriers to entry for non-European groups. Yet their deliberately broad and vague definitions permit complete reversal when applied strategically by the historical majority. In Western contexts, they have long been used to critique and attack any systems that once excluded or limited non-European entry, but the oppositional reframing, racial preferentialism that elevates European-descended majorities, selective inclusion that curates access based strictly on cultural and ethnic alignment, and protective bias that legitimizes open favoritism toward one's own people, directly prioritizes the preservation of historical majorities. This inversion serves as a direct countermeasure to open border policies by championing frameworks that demand rigorous assimilation, cultural congruence, and exclusion of those who fail to fit, rather than endless diversity influxes that erode the founding population. Legal architectures in Western nations amplify this inherent duality to an extreme degree, where anti-discrimination provisions are written so loosely that they permit assertions of harm or preference from virtually any angle, enabling claims that completely reverse traditional victim-oppressor narratives. What has been labeled positive discrimination, such as quotas or set-asides in employment, education, and contracting, functions in reality as overt discrimination against white populations of European descent, systematically disadvantaging them in favor of other groups under the pretext of addressing alleged historical wrongs. There were no legitimate, past disparities justifying this. the mechanisms were never about rectification but about engineered displacement and punishment of the founding stock. Negative discrimination against non-whites is heavily prohibited in public and many private domains, but the system allows and even incentivizes discrimination against whites as supposedly corrective. Hypothetical counterconstructs include meritocratic exclusion that leverages neutral-sounding criteria, such as proven economic self-sufficiency, high linguistic mastery, or absence of welfare dependency, to exert powerful indirect pressures that discourage or block settlement by low-skill or high-welfare populations. Protective bias further entrenches this by rendering cultural and racial favoritism not only commonplace but defensible, drawing direct parallels to how small indigenous or tribal communities assert territorial, resource, and membership rights without apology or external guilt. Constitutional safeguards for free speech in the United States and analogous protections in Canada facilitate the open articulation of these views and preferences, provided they avoid narrow legal definitions of direct incitement to violence, thereby laying critical groundwork for gradual escalation through electoral victories, policy reform, and democratic channels that reassert national and ethnic priorities over globalist egalitarianism. The wider ramifications of this reclamation encompass entirely non-violent, non-judicial pathways toward effective expulsion or removal of foreign elements, beginning with powerful discursive and rhetorical instruments that reshape public opinion, shift Overton windows, and ultimately dictate legislative and administrative agendas. Bureaucratic hurdles, stringent enforcement of existing visa and residency rules, and deliberate creation of inhospitable social and economic climates can cultivate environments that prompt voluntary departure or self-deportation without any need for overt coercion or physical force. Reclaiming these terms as situational imperatives and natural defenses directly counters the pervasive global indoctrination, through education systems, media, and international organizations, that portrays openness and friendliness as moral imperatives while undermining the autonomy and self-determination of Western founding populations. Through this complete narrative flip, populations of European lineage in Canada, the United States, and other Western societies cultivate genuine long-term viability and resilience, deftly maneuvering the existing moral, legal, and jurisprudential landscapes to sustain ethnic and cultural uniformity, thwart demographic replacement, and halt the ongoing erosion of their foundational identities and sovereignty. Legal ambiguity and bidirectional enforcement. The deliberate vagueness and expansive wording built into the definitions of racism, discrimination, and prejudice enable their highly subjective and discretionary application, with statutes and human rights codes crafted in such sweeping terms that they empower judges, bureaucrats, and enforcement agencies to interpret and weaponize them unevenly according to whoever holds institutional power at any given moment. Frameworks that claim to be dedicated to equality under the law in fact engender profound contradictions, mandating surface-level impartiality and colorblindness while simultaneously sanctioning biased implementations that consistently favor prevailing ideological or demographic power structures. This structural setup empowers any identifiable demographic or interest group to leverage the very same safeguards and legal mechanisms against adversarial prejudices or policies, operating as a form of reciprocal deterrence that prevents any single faction from achieving permanent unilateral dominance. Within contemporary immigration and demographic replacement discourses, this built-in duality permits forceful counterassertions that directly challenge and undermine initiatives, quotas, or policies that privilege recent arrivals and non-Western populations, repositioning what is labeled discrimination as an essential, legitimate, and necessary bulwark for protecting cultural integrity, economic resources, and national cohesion against rapid demographic overhauls engineered from above. Enforcement selectivity mirrors prevailing ideological tides and political alignments with precision, contracting under periods of strong nationalism to elevate and prioritize the legitimate concerns, grievances, and interests of the entrenched historical majorities over those of transient or invading minority groups. Capitalizing on these legal provisions for the specific benefit of one's own group entails tactical and persistent filings of complaints, pursuit of strategic litigation, public advocacy campaigns, and electoral pressure, all of which provide tangible advantages to those who perceive, and in fact experience, cultural diminishment, economic displacement, job undercutting, and welfare system exploitation. The dual nature of these laws and concepts guarantees that no single faction can forever monopolize legitimate grievance or victim status, thereby authorizing consistent two-way utilization to mitigate and reverse the very real job losses, wage suppression, housing shortages, and resource strains directly attributable to mass influxes from incompatible regions. Institutions, whether corporations, universities, government agencies, or media entities, integrate these prejudices and biases deeply into their entrenched operational conventions, hiring practices, and resource allocation norms, making them highly adaptable and maneuverable through sustained, coordinated advocacy efforts from below. Meaningful transformation originates at the personal and individual tier through conscious mindset shifts and small daily acts of boundary setting, then rapidly expanding outward to organized clusters, affinity networks, and pressure groups that collectively steer corporations, educational bodies, and public institutions toward policies and practices aligned with ethnic and cultural preservation. This cascading, ripple effect influence progressively reorients entire establishments to emphasize conservation of the founding population's resources, opportunities, and spaces, harnessing the very interpretive leeway and ambiguity of the existing legal order as a potent strategic asset for reclaiming sovereignty, fortifying communal resolve, and reversing engineered demographic decline. Scaling from individual to collective empowerment. Personal fortification and empowerment commence with a deliberate embrace of defensive choosiness and protective selectivity, lawfully articulating clear preferences and boundaries in non-public, private, and voluntary arenas in order to delineate and defend personal and familial space from external imposition. Recognizing and naming the encroachments, exploitations, and hostile impositions imposed by external entities, whether individuals, organized groups, or institutional policies, authorizes legitimate, lawful retorts such as filing formal grievances, lodging discrimination complaints when whites are disadvantaged, refusing voluntary association, or simply withdrawing participation and goodwill. This fundamental recalibration shifts the default posture from passive acquiescence and pathological openness to proactive stewardship and agency, channeling finite personal energies, time, social leverage, and emotional resources toward genuine self-sustenance and in-group advancement amid relentless competitive and replacement pressures from foreign populations. At the group echelon, this individual-level empowerment evolves naturally into the forging of alliances, informal networks, affinity organizations, and formal associations designed for heightened collective impact, coordinating large-scale initiatives such as signature drives, awareness campaigns, boycotts of exploitative entities, public demonstrations, and targeted electoral efforts to amplify isolated voices into a unified roar. Establishments and institutions begin to enact overt favoritisms and preferences via operational guidelines and internal policies, such as prioritizing regional or heritage-based recruitment, enforcing strict cultural fit standards, or redirecting resources away from programs that disproportionately benefit newcomers, once sufficient pressure is applied. Effectively swaying these larger entities requires persistent grassroots involvement, strategic coalition building, and the creation of cross-linked partnerships that compel corporations, school boards, local governments, and other power centers to adopt and institutionalize preservationist stances as a matter of survival and legitimacy. This empowerment framework openly concedes and embraces the mutual, reciprocal applicability of these conceptual tools across all groups, deliberately inverting and weaponizing them to ensure the long-term survival, prosperity, and dominance of the founding Western population against entrenched systemic prejudices, engineered guilt narratives, and institutional biases that have for decades operated in the opposite direction. It propels steady progression from mere defensive endurance and survival to aggressive structural overhauls and reforms, harmonizing social and political interactions through deliberate, conscious selectivity while avoiding endless retaliatory cycles that benefit no one. Ultimately, this scaling process solidifies unbreakable communal cohesion, restores rightful control over institutions, and establishes a functional, self-reinforcing system of ethnic and cultural self-preservation capable of withstanding and reversing ongoing invasion and infiltration. Spectrum of confrontational and non-confrontational methods. Confrontational methods within this reclaimed framework center on non-physical expressions that clearly signal personal and group boundaries without crossing into criminal territory. These include deliberate shifts in tone, such as cold, clipped responses or dismissive inflections, that communicate disinterest or rejection toward unwanted interactions from foreign elements. Facial expressions like narrowed eyes, tight lips, or averted gazes serve as immediate, instinctive tools to convey disapproval or superiority, discouraging further engagement while remaining fully within the bounds of free expression. Gestures, ranging from subtle shoulder shrugs to more pointed turns of the body away from the other person, reinforce these signals, creating an immediate social barrier that feels natural rather than forced. The objective is to make the invading presence uncomfortable enough to prompt withdrawal or reduced presence, all while staying well below legal thresholds for harassment, which typically require repeated, targeted, and intent-to-harm behavior. These confrontational tools operate most effectively in everyday encounters, retail settings, public transit, workplaces, where the initiator retains plausible deniability and the recipient is left with no actionable complaint. Non-confrontational methods emphasize complete withdrawal of energy, attention, and participation, exercising the fundamental personal right to associate or not associate as one chooses. Neglect manifests as ignoring requests for help, refusing small favors, or simply failing to acknowledge the presence of certain individuals in shared spaces. Avoidance takes this further, deliberately choosing different routes, seating areas, checkout lines, or social events to eliminate contact entirely. Withholding customary courtesies, such as holding doors, offering seats, or engaging in polite small talk, becomes a quiet but powerful assertion of preference. These actions require no verbalization and leave no trace of illegality. They are simply the exercise of autonomy in a society that already permits selective friendliness. By consistently applying neglect and avoidance, individuals conserve emotional and social capital for their own group while signaling that certain populations are not entitled to the same level of welcome or inclusion traditionally extended to fellow Westerners of European descent. The spectrum's true power lies in its flexibility and calibration to context, time, place, and personal comfort level. In highly public or monitored settings, government offices, large retail environments, or diverse workplaces, the approach defaults to passive, covert non-engagement, minimal eye contact, neutral facial expressions, and total emotional detachment. In more private or semi-private domains, neighborhood gatherings, family-oriented events, or small businesses, the individual can escalate to assertive confrontation, sharper tones, explicit boundary-setting language, or overt physical distancing. Productivity in application requires constant risk assessment, weighing the likelihood of backlash, the potential for escalation by the other party, and the overall impact on social acceptability. Subtlety remains the guiding principle in early stages to preserve deniability and avoid alienating potential allies. Over time, consistent use across aggregated individual choices normalizes these behaviors, gradually shifting social norms toward overt acceptance of selective hostility as a legitimate response to perceived invasion and cultural threat. Historical and contemporary applications. Historical nativist movements in the United States and other Western nations provide clear precedents for employing these conceptual tools against waves of foreign influx. In the mid-19th century, groups like the Know-Nothings mobilized widespread prejudice and discrimination against Irish Catholic immigrants through public rhetoric, social ostracism, and organized avoidance, framing the newcomers as threats to Protestant Anglo-Saxon culture. This escalated into political influence, culminating in restrictive naturalization laws and local ordinances that limited Irish access to jobs and housing. Later, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 institutionalized racial preferentialism and selective exclusion, rooted in widespread public expressions of hostility, verbal attacks, boycotts of Chinese businesses, and physical separation in living spaces, that preserved economic and cultural dominance for the European-descended majority. These movements began with individual and community-level prejudice and avoidance before scaling to legislative victories that formally removed or deterred unwanted populations. Colonial-era hierarchies across European empires offer another layer of application, where overt and systemic discrimination maintained strict separation between colonizers and colonized. In British India, French Algeria, and Dutch Indonesia, daily interactions were governed by unspoken but rigidly enforced rules of racial superiority. Separate clubs, neighborhoods, transportation, and social events, condescending tones and gestures toward natives, and complete social neglect of indigenous populations outside necessary labor contexts. Segregation in the American South during the Jim Crow era extended this model domestically, using expressions of disdain, physical distancing, and institutional policies to enforce dominance and prevent racial mixing. These systems relied on a spectrum from passive non-engagement, refusing to share public facilities, to confrontational hostility, verbal slurs in private settings or public demonstrations of exclusion, all legally sanctioned at the time and culturally normalized as necessary for preservation of the ruling group's identity and resources. Contemporary applications demonstrate the ongoing vitality of these patterns in response to modern demographic pressures. In Europe, rising anti-immigration sentiments, particularly toward Muslim and African inflows, rely on public rhetoric, social media campaigns, and organized boycotts to advocate for national preference policies and reduced settlement. In Canada, communities facing rapid South Asian immigration have turned to economic countermeasures such as selective patronage, workplace avoidance, and neighborhood-level social exclusion to protect local jobs and housing. In the United States, border security debates feature public demonstrations, vocal confrontations at town halls, and grassroots advocacy that escalates from individual expressions of prejudice to collective pressure on institutions and elected officials. These examples illustrate a clear escalation trajectory, starting with personal discomfort and subtle non-engagement, moving through group coordination and public signaling, and ultimately influencing policy and institutional behavior, all within existing legal frameworks that permit free expression and association. Personal journey and escalation phases. The personal journey begins with acknowledgement, the conscious mental shift that recognizes racism, discrimination, and prejudice not as forbidden evils but as neutral, historically validated tools available for self-preservation. This phase involves private reflection, reading about past nativist successes, observing current demographic changes, and internally reframing guilt-inducing narratives as manipulative propaganda designed to disarm Western populations. Comfort develops through repeated mental rehearsal, affirming the legitimacy of protecting one's people, and small, low-risk tests of boundary setting in daily life. The goal is to dismantle internalized taboos, replacing them with the understanding that selective hostility is a natural and necessary response to invasion. Once this foundation solidifies, the individual feels empowered to move beyond covert thoughts into subtle behavioral expressions without fear of self-condemnation. Passive integration follows, where the person experiments with non-confrontational methods in safe, low-stakes contexts. This might include choosing not to smile at or make eye contact with certain individuals in public, deliberately avoiding shared elevators or lines, or withholding small acts of courtesy previously given indiscriminately. These actions normalize the mindset, proving that such choices carry no immediate negative consequences and often yield positive reinforcement. Greater personal peace, conserved energy, and subtle deterrence of unwanted approaches. Passive-aggressive escalation emerges next. Slightly sharper tones in unavoidable interactions, brief verbal dismissals, or pointed facial expressions that convey rejection without words. These tests occur in semi-private settings, grocery stores, community events, where feedback from peers or the environment can be observed. Success in these stages builds confidence, making the behaviors feel less forced and more instinctive. The final phases transition to overt functionality and institutional influence. Overt acts include open verbal assertions of preference in voluntary group settings, organized avoidance campaigns within communities, and public advocacy that normalizes protective bias. Comfort reaches a point where responses become automatic in high-stakes scenarios, confronting workplace favoritism toward foreigners, participating in demonstrations, or lobbying local institutions. This journey mirrors historical movement narratives, from individual awakening to collective mobilization, ultimately leading to innate, confident application of these tools for defense of cultural and ethnic continuity against ongoing replacement pressures. Conclusion: from acknowledgement to action, the path to ethnic self-determination and reversal. The reclamation of racism, discrimination, prejudice, and related conceptual tools represents a decisive strategic pivot for Western societies confronting relentless demographic replacement and cultural erosion. These terms, long weaponized to dismantle the ethnic and cultural foundations of nations like Canada and the United States, can and must be reclaimed as legitimate instruments of self-preservation by the historical European-descended populations. By openly acknowledging their neutrality as tools, rather than inherent moral evils, individuals and groups strip away the engineered guilt and taboo that have paralyzed resistance to mass immigration, job undercutting, welfare exploitation, and infiltration by incompatible foreign elements. This reclamation directly counters the synchronized globalist policies that have flooded Western countries with populations from regions such as South Asia, transforming openness and friendliness from virtues into exploitable vulnerabilities. Embracing the inherent ambiguity and bidirectional duality of existing legal frameworks allows these concepts to be turned against the very forces that impose them, creating a mirror image defense that restores balance to a system deliberately tilted toward replacement. Escalatory spectrums, from passive neglect and avoidance through subtle confrontational signals to overt assertions of preference, provide a full arsenal of adaptable, lawful resources calibrated to every context, time, place, and personal comfort level. These methods begin in the private sphere with emotional detachment and selective non-engagement, progress to passive-aggressive expressions in semi-public settings, and culminate in confident, normalized hostility when circumstances demand it. Historical nativist movements, colonial hierarchies, and segregation-era practices, alongside contemporary European anti-immigration campaigns, Canadian economic countermeasures, and American border security advocacy, prove the viability of this approach across centuries and continents. Each example shows the same progression. Individual awakening leads to group coordination, which in turn pressures institutions and reshapes policy. Comfort cultivation, through repeated mental reframing and small daily tests, transforms covert, guilt-ridden awareness into overt, unapologetic action, making protective selectivity instinctive and socially acceptable. The ultimate outcome of this framework is the full restoration of self-determination for Western founding populations. Strategic selectivity, choosing whom to include, engage, assist, or tolerate, directly addresses the exploitation of traditional friendliness that has enabled unchecked invasion and resource drain. By establishing firm social, economic, and cultural boundaries, this approach safeguards long-term ethnic and cultural integrity against engineered demographic decline. Empowerment flows directly from acknowledgement. The moment individuals cease viewing these tools as forbidden and begin employing them consciously, the psychological chains of imposed egalitarianism shatter. This shift creates a self-reinforcing cycle where personal agency inspires collective mobilization, collective action influences institutional behavior, and institutional alignment solidifies societal norms of preservation. In the end, this reclaimed framework delivers a balanced, proportionate, and sustainable societal response to existential threats. It rejects suicidal universalism in favor of natural group self-interest, mirroring the defensive instincts that every other people on Earth openly exercise without apology. Through consistent application across the escalatory spectrum, Western societies can halt infiltration, reverse displacement, and reclaim control over their destiny. The path forward is clear: acknowledge the tools, build comfort through practice, escalate lawfully according to circumstance, and never again permit openness to be used as a weapon against the founding stock. This is vengeance. It is restoration.